No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. Hello friends, Lee Seacamp here. You're listening to our Unabridged interview with Audrey Assad. Audrey has been one of my favorite artists to get to work with here in Nashville. For many years, she was one of our featured artists regularly, often on our live shows, in those days under the brand Tokens Show. And actually, some of my favorite artistic moments, memories of singing have been with Audrey. I think immediately, for example, of two performances at the Ryman, 2 different years down there. One singing, I was getting to sing lead on Bob Dylan's Slow Train, and having Audrey and Odessa Settles there with me. And then another one was when Audrey and Matt Maher and I sang that old beautiful song by Peter, Paul, and Mary, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Wonderful, wonderful memories, as is this particular memory that we're releasing today, taped live at the Sound Emporium here in Nashville. I was thinking that it's a sweet sort of gift from a friend to remember that most of your memories being with that friend related to beautiful artistic moments that were moving and just lovely. So I'm thankful. Enjoy this interview with Audrey Assad. Okay, so we've got Audrey Assad here in the studio at the Sound Emporium. Hello, Audrey.
Hello, Lee.
It's so delightful to have you back again.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's been too long. I don't remember when we were together last, maybe at a Ryman show in either end of 2019 or 2018.
Something. Or we taped something with masks on somewhere.
That's
last
right,
year.
we did. That's right, during the COVID,
yes.
Doing the online stuff. That's right. So
yes.
Anyway, great to have you back in. So,
thank you.
As those of you who have followed our experiments for a while, you know that if we get yet another brilliant musician, singer, songwriter around, then I want to sing with them. And so Audrey came in, and I thought, I wonder if Audrey knows this hymn. And it turns out that she didn't know this hymn 30 minutes ago, but now she does.
I do now.
And I asked if we could sing it together. So here it is. Flee as a bird to your mountain, thou who art weary of sin. Go to the clear flowing fountain, where you may wash and be clean. Fly, for the avenger is near thee. Call, and the Savior will hear thee. He on his bosom will bear thee. O thou who art weary of sin, O thou who art weary of sin. He will protect thee forever, wipe every falling tear. He will forsake thee, O never, sheltered so tenderly there. Haste now, the hours are flying, spend spend not the moments in sighing. Cease from your sorrow and crying. The Savior will wipe every tear. The Savior will wipe every tear. Thanks for playing that song.
Thank you for having me.
That song is special to me because when I was in grad school in South Bend, our house was literally next door to the church. And I was on staff for this church and did youth ministry for a couple of years. And it was both a wonderful church community and a crazy church community. We had some really crazy, difficult things happening. And yet some of the dearest friendships we had ever had, and people in our home all the time. And
sounds like a BBC television show.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it was like, you know. So it was the beauty and tragedy. And then doing grad school in theology also for me was tumultuous, marked by both the beauty and the pain of it, because you're doing this kind of rarefied, you know, theological conversations while also, before I started that program, one of the professors who's now dean at Yale Divinity School, at the time was at Notre Dame, he had coffee with me before I started the program, and he said, well, you should know that whatever character defects you have, you will be so distressed by the experience of grad school that you will have to learn to deal with them, because it will be like a crucible by which you have to learn to deal with them. And he was exactly right. And so I remember these occasions where I would go up to the church building, like I said, next door to our house, and I would be in these places of kind of mental distress. And I would sit alone in that auditorium, and I would sing that hymn by myself. And so I've always loved that hymn, and so I feel honored that you would play it and sing it with me. But I think the reason that I thought about that hymn and that story and knowing that we were going to get to talk is that knowing some about your story, and I don't want to put words in your mouth or reduce it in any sort of way, but at least I've seen these elements of your kind of in certain ways, obviously growing out of the Christian tradition, or you're coming from, nourished by, sustained by the Christian tradition, while at the same time struggling with, frustrated with, knowing what you can and cannot hold on to from the Christian tradition. And so in that vein, and knowing that you've been working on a memoir that's coming out, next year maybe?
Yeah, in about a year from now.
Yeah. Do you have a title yet?
Yeah, it's called Doubt Becomes Wonder. Doubt becomes wonder. Embracing the loss of everything you thought you knew. That's the tagline.
It's a beautiful title.
Thank you. It's from a song of mine, actually.
Oh, really?
Yes. Called Evergreen. And as I had written the first draft of the manuscript, I thought, boy, that feels like what I'm trying to say. Not that I'm going from doubt to wonder, but that doubt itself, when transformed by curiosity and joy and exploration, becomes something more akin to wonder than it feels like. The word doubt sort of conjures up images of angst, frustration, skepticism maybe. And I've been to all those places, but I've sort of moved inside them to a more curious and open space.
Yeah, I love Doubt Becomes Wonder. That's lovely. And I relate to some of what you just said in that I remember in my seminary years, before the South Bend years, in learning about modernity and the Enlightenment, you know, one of the philosophical models they talk about in epistemology is philosophical foundationalism. And so the idea being that in order to make any truth claims, you've got to find some foundation that, quote, all rational people agree on. And you build this foundation, and then you can build up your ethic or build up your doctrinal system, And
that makes sense. I get that.
But I remember a crisis moment for me in the seminary years was I remember being in this little prayer meditation space and being in one of those periods of doubt and finally saying, I can't damn well know I know anything that I know, And so then it was a sort of like, well, if I can't absolutely know anything, then I can't make any kind of claims and everything's up in the air.
That resonates. I've been there. I get there all the time still. I'm like, even the things I'm learning now, I mean, it's just my experience at the end of the day. I can't really know anything.
Yeah. So I want to explore that a little bit more in a moment, but let me go back to the notion of it as you look back. Mm-hmm. What are things that you've experienced that you still think of as nourishing in some way?
Mm-hmm. Oh, man. Well,
so let me start with that.
I think the number one experience of Christianity that I still both feel fondly about in retrospect and miss today in my daily life is corporate singing. I think it's the most spiritually, biologically wise practice of faith traditions, probably above anything else. If I just on my limited understanding of what it does for the psyche, for the body, and for the group, it's a really fantastic healing mechanism to sing in a group with people, to blend in, to harmonize, to hear voices lifted in song about things that are bigger than we are. And there's also these biological realities at play where, when you get onto, and this can happen with any kind of music. So it happens at Token Show all the time, I think, with the house band being as able to drop into flow state as they are. When you get into flow state with a group of people, there's a phenomenon called collective effervescence that takes place. And this can be induced in other ways other than music, like dancing, which is why I think in many, many indigenous traditions of faith, you see dancing and music as the sort of cornerstones of practice. And when you get into that state with people, you get into sort of a sympathetic, meaning a shared nervous system state. It's very soothing to the body, to the mind. Your heartbeats start actually syncing up with people given enough time. And so there's something very real happening there in the body that I think is reflected in a state of mind that can happen after singing. It's very soothing and I think physically healing, it's shown. And so like in my work years ago with dementia patients, I used to do music just as a volunteer at a nursing home. And it's amazing what people cannot tell you things or communicate how they're feeling. But if you play something that they know, it lights their brain up and they're able to communicate with you with their eyes and sing words, even if they're not talking. And so I'm such a believer in the power of that. My experience of it has been very nourishing, and I still miss that. I grew up in a hymn singing tradition, and I miss.
Yeah, y'all were a cappella tradition.
We were,
Yeah, my tradition was as well.
Yeah, I miss that a lot. I found that to be very nourishing.
Yeah. I some of my fondest memories of growing up are precisely that very same thing, both in kind of more formal worship gatherings. But also that was one of the things that we would do sometimes on a Friday night.
Yeah, my family was similar.
Yeah.
Friends, family. A lot of singing.
Yeah.
In my upbringing, and I really miss that.
But what's the phrase again? You just said what effervescence?
Collective effervescence.
Collective effervescence.
Yeah.
What's a resource on that?
I mean, there's a couple papers out there on it. You just Google collective effervescence.
Yeah, I want to check that out. But as I've been wondering, because I've had this notion about exploring something like that for a while. So, I'm grateful for the phrase. And then do you imagine that as far as one of the struggles or frustrations, that one of the primary things has been what you mentioned a moment ago about certainty or the inability to frame doubt in a means of possible engagement with life as opposed to a threat to a good life?
I think any critical thinker is frustrated by that inside religion because, and I mean, so much of this is anecdotal. There's no official moratorium on doubt in religion, you know?
Yeah, right.
There's no, I mean, other than maybe in the book of James where it says like the man who doubts is like what does it say?
Wave the sea.
Yes.
And, yeah.
So there's that, and that does get weaponized against it. But what I remember hearing a lot from people was there's good doubt and then there's bad doubt. It's sort of like good doubt is just you're double checking. It's like, oh, I just want to be sure that I'm really using my mind here and I'm not being swept away by my emotions, right? But the bad kind of doubt is when you genuinely begin to question the givens that all of it is built upon, such as God needed to make things right between people and God. If you start questioning that one, well, that's, slippery slope to hell, my friend. And so I thought eventually in my life, I thought, well, why shouldn't I question that? I mean, what's to fear on the other side of it? Well, the worst thing that could happen is I find out that it is true, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Like it's sort of like, what if it's not true? And if it is, then I'll find that out. If what I've been taught is true, that God shows himself to people who want to see, well, I do want to see. I do want to know. So what am I scared of exactly? And what I realized is what I was terrified of is that it was all, some kind of elaborate psychological mechanism we had, dreamed up to medicate our own pain. And I wouldn't say I land there now with religion, but that's what I was scared of finding out. But I kind of had to know.
Yeah.
So I just decided it was better to risk it and figure things out a little bit.
Yeah, I think that for me as well, certainly, well, a couple of things come to mind. One is that the sort of ways in which, and this has been documented by lots of historians, like I'm thinking about George Marsden, who did most of his career at Notre Dame. When he looked back at, when he wrote kind of one of the preeminent histories of evangelicalism and fundamentalism in the United States, one of the arguments that he makes is that fundamentalism is the flip side of modernism. And that they're both grounded in this sort of quest for certifiability that you can't doubt, which is fascinating to think about. That the fundamentalists and the modernists are both kind of doing the same thing, but just in different ways.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
A lot of science as a community, because science is not a monolith, but a lot of the community of science out there is so closed off to new understanding or the givens changing. And I think that's terrifying as well,
Yeah. So they've got that sort of quest for certifiability. And if, as I did, if I assume that possibility of certifiability is what it means to have faith, and then it gets questioned, then it just threatens to all fall apart, right? Nothing left at all.
Yeah, you can unravel it really fast if that's the foundation of things.
So we had this preacher when I was a kid who used to say, you got to know, it's right. And finally it was like,
easy.
Right.
No,
and so then it was like,
deal.
Well, hell, that you've set me up for failure.
Yeah, I can't do that.
Right, because I can't do that with anything.
No, you can't do that with anything.
Right. And so then it becomes a sort of different sort of way of construing what might be true and trustworthy.
Yes, and you have whole communities of people who are basically working at all times, maybe in the background of their rational consciousness, to convince themselves that everything that they believe is the absolute truth. And then it's difficult to unentrench people from that, because if they're wrong, their whole system is going to fall apart, which is terrifying for us, right? So we act in ways in the world based on that fear, that
defensiveness,
hurt people. Yeah.
Attacking and so forth. Yeah. So going back to that kind of foundationalist, that metaphor of a foundation, I'm drawing a blank on who the philosopher is at the moment, but he suggested that a more helpful analogy for thinking about convictions was not the building metaphor of a foundation, but the metaphor of a net or a web. And he said, consider a conviction as something that's held up in a web, and each strand that holds up that conviction might be some various thing. It might be because your mother told you, might be because your church told you, might be because you read it in the Bible, might be because you read it in a philosophical treatise, might be because you had this experience. And all of those things might be holding up a conviction. And typically our convictions don't fall of just one of those. If it's a substantive conviction, it doesn't immediately just fall just like that. It takes a lot of things to happen to cut those different threads, and then finally the conviction may fall.
Isn't that a great analogy? That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it is interesting how some things do fall and some things don't. As you quote unquote deconstruct stuff, there are things that still stand. I'm still not killing anybody.
Yeah.
I'm still not. There are things that I believe, or at least that I experience and trust to be true is such a hard word, but maybe worthy of faith.
Yeah.
Worthy of holding on to.
Right.
Not everything disappears, but it's amazing how much does sometimes when you allow those threads to be cut. That's very interesting.
What do you think about, for me, in that process, I look back on my life and I think it was pretty much in my undergraduate years and my seminary years where a lot of the intellectual deconstruction and then trying to reconstruct some of those things began to happen. And so I had really good professors that put me to really good resources that helped me not be afraid of the deconstruction and help me with the reconstruction that I'm really thankful for. That doesn't mean that I didn't have other subsequent moments of ready to throw everything out, throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. But that was key for me. But then, so that was kind of the intellectual processing. But I was surprised to discover that a lot of the stuff emotionally didn't get deconstructed because I wasn't aware of how deeply it was in me emotionally. Shame in particular, until I was maybe late 30s, early 40s, and then even later in my later 40s. But do you relate to that kind of duality of processing?
Very much so. There's a great book, maybe you've heard of it, called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And it's sort of the seminal work on how the body holds our story and the things that have happened to us and the things that we have believed and the things that we have internalized in ways that may not be obvious to our conscious mind. And those things manifest themselves often when we have not given vent to them with our consciousness by understanding and seeing. And so there's this kind of, there's a word I'm looking for. It's almost like skiing, like where, part of, if I think of one arm and one leg or whatever one arm, I guess in this case, as my rational mind and the other as my body, they're working at different paces at different times. And sometimes I'm working with them together. You can't see this, those of you who are just listening, but I'm using like skiing motions, right and left, and then both arms together. Sometimes they're working in tandem and you sort of get the understanding and you heal what's in your body, but sometimes your body will manifest your fear for you. For me, that started happening in 2016 when I sort of began having these horrible anxiety attacks every time I set foot in a church building. And at that point, I still hadn't really questioned anything. I mean, I just kind of started the idea of hell, for example, as a place of eternal conscious torment was something I was beginning to unpack and look at and sift through. And then I started having these panic attacks and then physical tics in my hands. And what I came to realize through a trauma therapist I ended up working with was that was my body sort of giving me an alarm that things were not emotionally okay around these topics and that I needed to do some excavation and some healing. And so that was what ultimately woke me up to it, was my body's manifestation of my emotions. I had not really dealt with any of that from my upbringing because I knew it was there intellectually, but it's not always easy to think yourself out of things that your body is holding.
Yeah. Yeah, and some sort of experiential moment to get that exposed or to be able to see it for what it is, and different ways of getting at that. I'm wondering about for you anger? In what ways has anger played or not played a part in your own experience and or processing of your experience?
I'm smiling to myself because I think I'm still yet to find that out, to be honest. I have the type of temperament, and I don't know if this is nature, nurture, or some combination of both. It was reflected to me by a friend recently that I try to hold the whole world in tension and unity. Meaning, from Ted Bundy to Mother Teresa, I'm like, how can I make room for both of you as human beings with a soul? And, and so there are things in my past that I probably have every right to be angry about. And if I'm honest, I probably am angry about them. But accessing that anger is difficult for me. Mm-hmm. I have to go through a lot of grieving to get to feeling mad. I don't think I've ever yelled at a person in my life. It's just not my way.
Yeah.
But I'm aware now that some of that may be repression. So I'm working towards it. I would say that
God help the one that's on the front end of that.
Let us pray that it's like a stuffed animal. Or I bought a thing the other day from a metaphysical shop, we'll call it, called a damn it doll.
A damn it
and
doll?
It's a stuffed doll but it's kind of firm in the hand. It's not super soft. So like it makes a really satisfying thwacking sound. So you're supposed to hit things with it and say, damn it. And I bought myself one because I was like, I'm going to try it on a stuffed animal and see if I can maybe keep it directed at inanimate objects.
Yeah.
But I do genuinely think that maybe this is a gift of mine. I think I do really desire to see everyone, even people who have potentially, abused me, as a whole person. That is, they're independent of me and of my experience of them. And so I'm still learning about anger, but I think it's a very important emotion to listen to.
Yeah.
Very important to hear anger and what it has to communicate, because anger, my friend, she's a psychologist named Dr. Hillary McBride, and she says anger reveals to us what we're trying or what we're afraid of, and fear represents what we're trying to protect, So what was unprotected in me?
Yeah, and similarly, I've heard it said that anger is often triggered when there's a breaking of some sort of boundary, either real or projected boundary of some sort. And so that helps me frame anger as a very important, helpful communication to myself.
And it's really not rewarded inside religion. Typically, at least in fundamentalist evangelicalism, anger would probably be reserved for the pulpit, discouraged in a parishioner. It's sort of like
that's interesting. Yeah.
Gain control of yourself, but also then you're hearing God's wrath preached at you.
Right.
And it's okay when you're mad at someone else for something they've done in judgment. But when something has happened to you that's been painful, I don't think it's really allowed the same way. Maybe particularly for women. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure it's the same for a lot of men too. So very important. And it's not a negative emotion. It just is.
It just is.
It just is.
Yeah, and it strikes me that so much of, we've been talking about doubt and we've been talking about anger here most recently, but for me, the key, and I always tell my students this, I always say, especially when it's paper writing time, I always say, nuance is your friend, right? And avoid overgeneralized statements. And so it's like, even in Scripture, in the New Testament, you got, be angry, sin not, It's like, there's time to be angry.
Yeah, there absolutely is.
But just don't fall into a pit that's going to take you down with it, right?
Maybe bitterness is something we'd like to avoid, but anger doesn't always lead to bitterness. Sometimes anger leads to liberation
and constructive
and
change,
peace.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And similarly with doubt, it's like, Thomas Merton had this line about doubt, where he said, the way to deal with doubt is to go through it. It's just a part of what it means to be living as a human being. And I've often said that people who have not been through substantive moments of doubt. Well, let me put it positively. Because I don't want to put it negatively or judgmentally, but I generally find that people who have been through periods of doubt have reflected upon the nature of what they're seeking to live by in a way that those who have not been through periods of doubt perhaps have not.
Absolutely. And I feel that way. I also feel that people who have questioned the nature of reality and who are at peace with whatever they have found or not found are people that I trust.
Yeah.
If someone has really never questioned the nature of reality, it's not that I don't love or trust them, but more so that there might be a threshold of trust that I don't easily reach with that person for them to advise me on life and life's existential dreads. It's sort of like questioning the nature of reality is a part of having your eyes open, I think. And so that could be framed as doubt, I suppose.
It's also, I think it relates to, I much more quickly find rapport with someone who is able to share with me their own places of brokenness or the ways they've screwed up.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think the vulnerability in that then invites vulnerability in return.
Yeah. And there's vulnerability in all of those things.
Yeah.
Actually, to doubt, to question the nature of reality, to confess your own brokenness, all of those things are very vulnerable things.
Yeah, that's right. I think that as well. So what has been the process of writing been like for you? Is it, I guess the question I've got in the back of my mind, again, not wanting to put words in your mouth, but the only way I get through writing and do writing generally, well, that would be an overstatement. Let me put it this way. Sometimes, and a lot of times, I experience writing, especially if I'm reflecting upon a memoirish kind of stuff. It's very much as a sort of spiritual discipline where I end up seeing things I didn't see or might not see otherwise. And Augustine has this line where he says, I write in order to understand. And I think that when we're doing writing about ourselves, or when I write about myself, I can discover certain frames or a new narrative framework to make sense of things that I didn't see unless I did the act of writing. Has that been your experience at all?
Very much so, much like songwriting. I mean, I've been a songwriter for a long time, and I've actually written essays and short stories for longer than I've been a songwriter. And I think I've always written to understand. I mean, it's how I survived my childhood, was to sing, play, write, in order to feel my own resilience, in order to find compassion for others, in order to attempt to heal my tormented relationship with a God that I believed was sort of a glorified Santa Claus checking his list at best, at kindest. And so, yes, my experience of writing this book has been like that. Yeah. And I also see why authors often get driven to the drink, because it's sort of like, I'm in an airport lounge drinking my second double mezcal, going like pulling my hair out. I don't want to write about purity culture. Ugh, I don't want to know more about it. I don't want to think about it anymore. But it's like, it's been a very fruitful, life-giving experience to examine those stories with that type of lens.
Yeah. So a moment ago you said, in talking about anger, suspicion of maybe this is different for men than it is for women, which prompts me to ask, talk to us a little bit about the last decade or so of what you're seeing about or coming to understand about being a woman.
Okay.
I know that's way too broad of a question.
In 3 minutes.
I guess I want to see what you do with that question.
Give us the rundown on being a woman today.
Because clearly
in
that
the church,
clearly that relates to the Christian tradition, right?
Right.
Christian tradition struggling with it, but it's not just the Christian tradition; it's the American tradition.
Right. Yes, but arguably that's also the Christian tradition.
At least
it's sort of like
related.
they've bled into each other a little bit. I think that my I mean, I've questioned the nature of everything, including gender essentialism over the years. I've dived into feminism and the different waves of feminism to understand them a little bit more and what they do and don't believe about gender and sex and how they're related. And, that was something I was taught never to question. It's sort of like, here's the body part, that's the gender. Here are the things that go with it, both aesthetically and, spiritually, meaning virtues were assigned to the genders differently. I don't know if that was your experience, but that was my experience.
That was definitely my experience.
Women need to be meek. In my tradition, it was total silence, in any spiritual environment, meaning no reading scripture out loud, no praying out loud, no singing in front of the church as a woman. So there were very strict rules around that. So of course I started to question it because they were so extreme that I couldn't help it, with my mind being so curious.
We were laughing last night about a story of Ashley Bain and I were laughing about comparing, one-upping each other on. and I said, we had this episode in one church I was in where we had a deaf ministry, and the woman was interpreting for the deaf, and finally she was told that she could no longer interpret for the deaf because that was a form of speaking before men.
There's so many things inside that I don't have time to get into about all kinds of issues. But, I mean, it resonates, I think that questioning the nature of all those things is important because there are so many people in my own life even who live in between those worlds in various ways, in between those directives. I'm one of those people. To look at me now, people who follow me on Instagram or have seen me in person know that I don't really exhibit femininity in a traditional sense in certain ways, and it feels more natural to me to sort of blend. And I don't know if I go full androgynous, but I'm very inspired by people like David Bowie because he played with those things so whimsically. It invited me into a conversation about, maybe being a girl doesn't mean XYZ automatically.
Yeah.
And I think that's valuable conversation, really, really healing conversation for a lot of people.
And you don't have to go very far into exploring that to realize there's all sorts of socially relative identification with regard to arbitrary stuff with regard to gender.
I saw I dropped my son off at pre-K when he was in pre-K in person a few years ago and noticed that they started immediately with the blue and pink pencil cases, It's like, that's totally arbitrary. Color's just a frequency that we're interpreting with the cones and rods in our eyes. It's not, there's nothing essential about it.
Well, and we had one of our most popular podcast episodes in our first season was with Lawrence Meltzer White, giving us a kind of a crash course on the history of feminism. And she said at some point in that interview something like, well, you know that 150 years ago, the men were wearing high heels and wigs.
Yes, they were.
And pink. And I said, no, satin. I don't know that.
They were. Read The Scarlet Pimpernel. It's a great book and a great movie as well. But yes, that was the fashion of the time. It just evolves with culture as always. And so I think, to answer your question, my experience of being a woman as a Christian was damaging in most ways. Growing up, I did not have an experience of that affirmed or uplifted my gender. I've had to do a lot of recovering from that experience and reclaiming of things. And even just as a Catholic, when I was, heavily in that world, Mary being held up as the paragon of virtue. Well, Mary is considered by the Catholics to have never had sex. Her labor was probably painless, according to Catholic tradition. It left me feeling like I have to be a disembodied half person to be like the most virtuous woman there was. And I know a lot of people will feel offended by that perspective on it, but that's how I felt, sort of hearing her lifted up as the example, the primary example of virtue and goodness. It was like, but she didn't go through, according to tradition, go through the things that make us feel human. You don't have to have sex to be a human being, of course, but that it was considered heresy to believe she didn't, or that she did have sex, ever in her life was so strange to me and disembodying. And yeah, I'm ready to live in my body like a real hands in the dirt human being. And I'm kind of willing to take some risks of perhaps stepping over a line here or there to do so, because what I know is that I lived for so long on tenterhooks and biting my nails at every possible misstep that I didn't experience most of my life in embodied reality. So it's got to be another way, right?
Yeah.
Without becoming a total, I mean, there's nothing, I don't even know if there's anything wrong with hedonism. It's just, I don't know if that's what I want to do, you know, but I want to be real. I want to be salty and I want to live in this body.
Yeah. I was one of the major traditions that helped me, that's been a major framework for me intellectually, that's helped me deal with getting over moralisms and legalisms, has been the virtue traditions, in which any so-called moral is always geared towards an end and some sort of vision of what it means to be flourishing as a human being, as opposed to just there are these rules you got to keep for whatever reason, you know, because they're the rules. And in virtue tradition, typically any virtue, let's say courage, is a mean, not an arithmetic mean, but it's between two vices. There's cowardice, doesn't have enough of it, or there's foolhardiness that doesn't pay enough attention to fear. So the cowardice pays too much attention to the fear and gets paralyzed, and the foolhardiness refuses to pay attention to fear.
I love that.
Isn't that great?
Yes.
And I think that that's so helpful in thinking about as well my own kind of periods of growth. It's like if I've been pushed by a tradition so far down into one of those vices, then it's almost like part of your growing is you're probably going to make mistakes on the other side of the virtue, and in time you want to come back to the space there that is the mean, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes, like for me, for example, when I realized that I was conflict averse, that meant that sometimes I was a jackass by the way I started talking to people in dealing with conflict. But I could see, okay, well, I hadn't got to where I want to get to yet because I want to figure out how to deal with conflict in a way that's not me being a jackass.
Yeah.
But that me acting that way sometimes was actually a step forward because it meant I was willing to lean into the direction I need to lean into.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's part of the healing when you grew up with the idea of a God who would smite you, you know, for any infraction of the rules.
Who was the great divine legalist.
Yes. And so when you begin to experience mistakes and recovery and repair, you begin to be a whole human being.
Yeah.
And, you know, God never smote me so far.
Yeah. Well, and, you know,
it could happen any day.
The very word that we translate in English, sin, is this Greek word hamartia, which is grounded in virtue tradition because hamartia was a word for archery, which was hitting the target, right? So you can miss the target in all sorts of ways. But it wasn't a legalistic idea of you break the rule and so you get it. And even in Greco-Roman literature, non-Jewish, non-Christian Greco-Roman literature, the hamartia of a character was what finally could kill him.
I see.
Right? It's like, if you keep falling into this, then this is going to take you down. That's your hamartia. And so again, it's a very embodied, practical, this stuff can kill you. And this way you can live a life that's flourishing. And of course, then there's ongoing questions about how you narrate those or give account for those and so forth. But
wow,
I find that a much better way to try to make sense of the world and reality than I've got to satisfy some divine being because I've been given this list of rules, and if I don't keep them, then...
A little more explorative, a little less obsessive, maybe. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. In between cowardice and imprudence, somewhere there lies the promised land.
Yeah. Well, it's always a delight to be with you.
Thank you. Same.
It's I'm grateful for you and grateful for your honesty and your gentleness and the way you keep asking good questions and your own vulnerability, and grateful that you're here in Nashville and grateful that I get to call you a friend.
Thank you, Lee. Same here. God on
Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Our 2 interviews with Audrey Assad and Drew Holcomb were taped at the Sound Emporium here in Nashville. And for those in-studio performances, we had a killer house band: Scott Mulvihill, Sierra Hull, Brian Sutton, Aubrey Haney, Chris Brown, and Jeff Taylor. Mixing by Ross Collier, our live engineer in the studio, Joe Trentacosti. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.